So Saltaire was a model village. The original village was built over 25 years between 1850 and the end of the 1870s. It was established by a manufacturer, a textile manufacturer, who had 5 different factories in Bradford. His name was Titus Salt. And Titus Salt took the decision in the late 1840s, early 1850s, to consolidate his businesses, but also to do something about the housing conditions of his workers in Bradford. And so what you have is you have the development of this factory, so that's Salt's mills, but also I think the really important thing is not so much the mill, but what came afterwards, which is the village. All the housing, and we'll take a little bit of a walk round to show you what was so significant about this place, why it's remembered, why it's written into textbooks. Now the first thing that was built or completed was the mill, and this is a giant mill.
Yeah, it's huge.
Yeah, it was opened in 1853, so really quite soon after the plan was accepted by the local authorities, which would have been the city of Bradford.
Okay.
As I've already said, this mill was built to kind of consolidate and replace 5 separate mills in the centre of Bradford. So it was quite a good business decision in terms of making his business more efficient.
Yeah, okay.
And I don't think we can forget about that. Saltaire was a very good business venture, as well as being a very progressive idea in terms of welfare. It was good for his business to bring all of his factories together, and then to kind of bring his labourers very close by so that they could be very close to the factory. All types of advantages in terms of keeping his workforce healthy, and we'll see that in terms of the innovations in public health, but also quite close to the factory, kind of locked into the company, if you like. This was a company town. So Titus Salt was both the employer of the people who lived here and also the landlord.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Right.
So kind of killing 2 birds with one stone. It had a kind of a nice kind of symmetry, if
They
you
had
like.
everything under control.
Exactly.
Yeah,
Exactly.
and that's important when you have workers.
Yeah.
If you look into the Titus Street and then George Street, it's like so different kind of houses.
That's right.
Why is that?
Well, it was because the houses were of different sizes because they were reflecting a kind of a social hierarchy.
Okay.
So you had smaller houses within the centre of the village, and we're in the centre of the original building as it was originally built.
Okay.
And you get a kind of a social hierarchy built into the environment, whereby the kind of the less skilled workers who lived in Saltaire had smaller houses.
Okay.
The kind of the overlookers or the managers, middle managers, had larger houses by and large. And then by the time we get to the Albert Road, you have the executive houses, which are much larger. Now, these are 2 of the earliest streets that were completed. We're in Titus Street, where, as you can see, there's a kind of a 2 up, 2 down Victorian terrace, which is reflected in many parts of northern England. It's a kind of a style of architecture we associate with the north of England. It's a typical coronation stripe street house. In George Street, you have effectively the same type. It's a terrace, but these are bigger houses. They've got a courtyard to the front, so they've got greater outdoor space, and they will have larger rooms inside. I should stress that by the kind of the standards of the day, both types of houses were seen as being good houses.
Okay.
So the smaller houses were for their type and scale and size, were seen as good terraced housing.
Okay.
Similarly with somewhere like George Street. There were innovations in terms of the housing in Saltaire, in terms of how much ventilation was kind of accessible to each house. The fact that each house had a lavatory, an outside lavatory, as opposed to having to share a lavatory. The drainage system was better. There was just, from a public health perspective, this was a much better place to live than the centre of Bradford. Centre of Bradford, as with the centre of Leeds, was known for its back-to-back housing. So those are houses where you don't have a back door. There is no back door, there's a back wall, which is someone else's back wall as well.
Oh wow.
And people, we have accounts of people who really loved living in that because there's a kind of very strong sense of community. But from a public health perspective, the housing in Saltaire was simply better. People lived longer here with less rates of health conditions than they would have done 3 miles away in the centre of Bradford. The mortality rates were lower.
Okay.
One thing I want to show you, just at the corner of Titus Street and George Street, is a house with a very, very, well, a high tower, Watchtower. It's high by Saltaire standards. It's bigger than any other structure. There isn't a similar structure in Saltaire. But I believe if you go into the top of that Watchtower, you won't actually see the entire village, or you won't have a kind of a comprehensive view. But in a sense, that's secondary to the fact that people would have perceived it on the streets as being a place over which they could be watched. There's also a legend with this house that Titus Salt just wanted to keep an eye over the population. One of the things that he had a bit of a thing about was people displaying their dirty laundry in public. He didn't like it. There's a kind of a saying, a colloquial saying, never hang your dirty laundry in public, which means don't kind of discuss your private affairs in public more generally. But there is a bit of a myth that this is where it comes from. It comes from Victorian prudes like Titus Salt going around and telling people off for showing their knickers in public.
Yeah.
But again, that's Victorian prudery. We are standing in Titus Street, and a couple of things to say about this street, some interesting features. So one, we're standing behind on the Methodist Church. Titus Salt wasn't a Methodist himself, but he was a nonconformist. So in terms of nonconformity means at this time, and earlier centuries, these are Protestant churches which didn't conform to the teachings and practices of the Church of England, the Anglican Church. So they broke away.
Okay.
Now, what's important about the social history of England is that these industrialists, some of the big significant members of the commercial elites, came from humble beginnings themselves. They weren't aristocratic. They weren't tied into the traditional forms of power. But during the Industrial Revolution, they made their fortunes and they changed the social and political landscape of England. So Titus Salt was a Congregationalist, and we'll show you the church that he built for his own church. But he also believed that his workers should have a freedom of worship. And that meant providing for other churches within the village itself or close by. He didn't give them money to build the Methodist Church, but he allowed land to be set aside for other churches.
Right, so his workers could go into his church over there to do some worship.
They could, or they could, if they were members of a church themselves, they could go to that church. They had a kind of a freedom of worship. And again, that's quite important in terms of understanding his religious background.
And that's quite modern thinking, because when you think about Henry, like the kings of England, like Henry VIII, I think he's like, oh, no, don't do that.
Yeah.
But what is special about this village is here are still people living here.
Yeah.
Because we saw some sandwich bars, some coffee shop along the streets. And I'm wondering, are people still working in this mill?
Yes.
Are they still doing the same business?
They're not. The mill closed in the 1980s. It kind of suffered a period of decline.
Yeah.
I mean, it's linked into wider issues of globalization and the way in which the manufacturing industries in the north of England were superseded kind of in the decades leading up to the 80s as well as in the 80s itself. It closed in 1986. What was interesting about Salt's mill, Saltaire, is that the mill didn't stand empty for long. It was bought up by a local entrepreneur, a businessman called Jonathan Silver, who, by a kind of a pleasing kind of twist of fate, was a kind of a clothing designer. So kind of worked with textiles or what have you. But he didn't reopen it as a site of manufacturing. He reopened it as a gallery. So he had connections with a local artist, David Hockneys from Bradford. So international artist who left some of his works to be kind of displayed here. So we've got a permanent gallery in that building, which is still there, arranged over a couple of floors. The place is full of his work.
Cool.
It's carefully curated stock. I'm not saying this kind of as a bit of an advertisement, but actually, in terms of a cultural resource,
Yeah, it's definitely good.
I think actually places as big as Leeds and Bradford need independent booksellers as good as that.